Welcome to the quick start video for Rocket Lasso's newest plugin, Ricochet. Now, this is a new spline tool, and it can do a lot of different cool things. This video is meant to be an overview of kind of the basic features of it and some cool use cases. But this is not meant to be comprehensively going over every single aspect of the tool. So I recommend going and checking out the individual training videos so you can learn exactly what every single parameter does and just every other detail so you can get full use out of it. I've got these three 3D posable figures. You can find them inside the content browser or the new assets browser underneath Objects, Humans, 3D Posable Silhouettes. What's great about them is you can select the different limbs and completely change the pose really easily. It makes for good silhouettes. I used them in a lot of pre-visualization back in the day. These have been in cinema for probably more than 15 years. But they've become a lot more powerful with things like the volume builder and volume mesher. Adding those in, this will blob together and I can make a seamless silhouette if I wanted to. This volume is perfect for talking about Ricochet, so that's the one we want to start with, hiding the other two characters. For now, let's zoom in on this character and under extensions, find Ricochet, or possibly under plugins, depending on what version of Cinema you have. Creating that, I would like to move it directly over to the character and move it up so that I'm sure that it is pivoting from somewhere inside the volume of this mesh. Now, with it in position, I'll drop the mesher as a child, and the instant that I do, it is going to consume that mesh and instead return a spline. We can now see this spline bouncing around inside of the model. So that's what Ricochet does. It generates a line from the origin point of this Ricochet and will strike whatever mesh has been fed into it and bounce around inside of it or outside of it, depending on where it is striking it. Selecting Ricochet, we can take a look at a couple of basic settings. First of all, here's the length, so we could lower that down to 0 or crank this way up, and as we do, we see more of the overall character kind of filling in that silhouette. And now that it's bouncing around a little bit, I could click this seed button, and there's a randomize icon, so I can click random a few times, and I can try different silhouettes as it's bouncing around in slightly different ways. Now we've got 10,000 in length. Let's go and add an extra 0 in there and make it 100,000 in length. Instantly, it's going to generate this more complex spline, and you can see how many lines there now are filling up this character. But let's push that even further and put another 0 in there. So there's now 1,000,000 in length, and pretty much instantly it calculates that, and we can zoom up, and you can see that this thing is almost completely full of lines to the point where we now have this perfect silhouette because there are so many lines. I'll reduce this back to something reasonable. We'll just do the natural length here. Something to point out is we left every parameter that we possibly could be unclamped. So of course this number can go way above. You could even go negative, and that will shoot backwards out of your original origin point. Well, let's get that full length here and then take a look at the next setting, which is angle. Currently angles mode is set to random, and here's that randomness. Random can be reduced all the way down to 0, and now there's no randomness whatsoever. It is just the Ricochet line's angle and the angle of the polygon, and that is the way it reflects off of it. And it just continues through the entire mesh. If I were to hit randomize on the seed, you'll see nothing changes because there is no randomness. And of course, random can be cranked way up. So now we're getting maximum randomness of 90 degrees. Random obviously will do a lot now as we click the seed and get completely different ways of filling up the entire model. And that can go anywhere in between. And again, that's unclamped. You can crank that up even higher and just fill up the overall object. If I were to try and take the Ricochet object and move it, you'll see that it will actually move itself and its child. So we can't really change that origin point if we wanted to. Now in Cinema, you can hold down the 7 key as you move an object, and that means its children won't move. So now I'm actually moving that origin point, which of course is changing every subsequent bounce from the Ricochet. Alternatively, though, inside of Ricochet, I can go to the orientation, click on that drop down, and you can see we got some different options. We could switch this over to Y or X and the positive negatives, but then there is also object. So if I select object, we could feed any object into this link field or click this create button and it'll automatically make a null. Selecting that null, I can move that around, and now the Ricochet is free to stay at its local position, and this will create a new angle and position that we can base it off of and place them exactly where we want them to be. Let's keep that organized. I'll drop the null inside the Ricochet, collapse it down, and let's move on to the next character. And you know what? I think I'd like to just copy and paste that volume builder so I can use its settings. So feeding in the zygote woman into that, get a brand new blob, and we can work from that. So brand new Ricochet, and now we'll use a completely different mode. First of all, well, let's move it forward, over, and up. And now you can see it should be, yeah, that should intersect with the character. So this time, instead of dropping the volume mesher as a child of the Ricochet, I can say, how about I want the source geometry not to be based off the children, but instead a list of objects. Selecting that, I can now remotely link into any object in the scene. So now dragging in the new volume mesher, you'll see that this is now ricocheting off the character, and I am free to move this up and down, and you see it's reflecting off the model as if this was a laser and this was like a mirrored surface. I can move it, rotate it, and while Ricochet is free to move, it is not moving the mesh because it's not a child of it. An important thing to note is we have now built in this kind of relationship between Ricochet and whatever objects we're feeding in, and the order of operations is now relevant, just like the MoGraph tracer object. You want to make sure that the objects are in the proper order, otherwise you might get this little viewport refresh. It'll still render correctly, but it might not refresh instantly. Making sure that the model comes before the spline is going to ensure that everything calculates in the right order. Just an important thing to make note of. Moving the Ricochet inside of the model, we see it bouncing around, but we can't really see it because the model's in the way. Selecting Ricochet, we have a handy Hide Sources button. Clicking that, it will hide the model because we've now got a display tag and a compositing tag on there with the exact same settings as the mesh deformer, which is very, very handy. We can now see this bouncing around inside. This time, I would like the Ricochet to have no randomness, but this time talking about alignment, we want to align to the surface and start cranking up the alignment. Now, before, we were just ricocheting off the surface and maybe getting some randomness, but now we're taking on the angle of the surface, meaning as I crank the alignment up, we're going to see this start following the curvature of the model. Cranking up the overall bounces here makes them more length. You see that there is a lot more curvature to that. I'll hide entirely the original model, and you see how smooth all these curves are. Where in this one, it's kind of harshly bouncing around. This one is curving around the character. Now, we can, of course, add in randomness on top of that. A little randomness will help fill out the overall model. Adding a couple clicks of the random seed, we can get different layouts where we like the way it's filling up the overall form. Random is great here, and I definitely use random sometimes. We have a different angle mode. Instead of using angle random, we'll use angle from surface. That way, as it's deflecting off a surface, it will continue to be perfectly aligned with it, but sort of spin it on that polygon. So as I add a bunch of this randomness, you're going to start seeing, and I'll go way up here, you now see that we still have this following around largely on the outside perimeter of the object, but there's a lot of curvature to the line because every time it bounces off the object, it might turn a little bit. So you can just see we've stylistically changed this a lot where there's all these neat little turns and curves. And then there is also the tilt setting. So it's kind of like random, except it always turns to one set direction. So you can start getting these nice little spirals in the character. Keep in mind that you only get a new turn when it bounces off a polygon. So it's very dependent on the way your mesh is laid out and how often it might be bouncing off of something. I usually add a little bit of randomness along with the tilt just to get some extra chaos in the scene. But just a little bit of randomness works really nicely there. I really love that combination of settings. I guess while we're here, let's talk quickly about normal. Normal is the opposite of surface. So if I crank up normal, you're going to see it's going to get very spiky looking because when it hits a polygon, instead of aligning with it, it's going to take on the direction of the normal and it becomes very, very spiky. If I crank up a bunch, you're going to see it gets very trapped in certain areas. If we do use a little bit, you see it has become quite spiky. Adding in a bit of regular random, we can crank that up and you see we can still fill the model up well, but it's very, very spiky, which is in contrast to, and I'll duplicate this Ricochet, in contrast to from surface and lots of surface instead of normal. So you can see we've got that sharp one bouncing around the side and a nice smooth one following around on the outside of the perimeter. Deleting that one bouncing around on the inside, we'll keep this surface one and take a look at the next settings. To do that, I'll feed this Ricochet into a sweep object. Holding Alt, it will become a parent automatically, and holding Shift, I'll create an inside. Set the radius to 1, and now we've got this nice sweep traveling along the model. I could smooth that out, jumping the sides up to 12, and you can see that's filled out this form nicely. We've got all of the geometry represented pretty well. If we were to zoom up, though, let's unhide that geometry. In fact, just temporarily, I will delete those render tags. You can see that these two models are colliding with each other. Let's make it jump out a little bit by dropping on a material, just a little contrast. You see that it's escaping. The actual line isn't escaping. If I turn off the sweep, you see the Ricochet is trapped very, very well inside of that model. But the sweep, of course, has a thickness of 1, so that can escape out of it. How would we compensate for that? Well, inside of Ricochet, under the Modify tab, we have a Source Geometry section, and inside there we have Surface Offset. Turning on Visualize, I can drag this outward, and you're going to see some orange dots represent pushing out from the model, expanding it. Or I can actually drag that down negative, and it'll turn blue because we're pushing into the model. So if I go -1 on that surface offset, you'll now see that all of those get pushed inside of the model. So visually hiding that model. Now we should have this representing pretty much perfectly that model without it escaping and expanding outside of it. A very important feature, and I was very excited when we figured out a way of adding that in. Next up is an important one. I'm not going to go too in depth on it, but that is the shell, the idea of a shell. And if I were to, well, let's see, turn off the sweep just so we can visualize and add on some shell, you're going to see that there are some orange dots pushing out and some blue dots pushing in. So that's creating a thin shell in between them. So if we trap a Ricochet in between those two, we can get it to not be filling out the internal shape, but instead traveling along in between those two layers of shell. I will grab this Ricochet. Actually, from the front view, we'll be able to see it very clearly. I can move Ricochet out entirely, and as I move it down, just as I barely get past those orange dots, we'll see it reflecting. And now it should be bouncing in between. You'll see if I pull it down further, we're inside of it. If I pull it up, now it's in between the two. Turning off Visualize, we should be able to rotate around here, and you can see that the interior of the model is empty, and just this outer shell is being filled in. So that works really well for a lot of additional options where you don't want the inside of this model being filled. If I turn that sweep back on, we could zoom inside here, and you can see that it is hollow. Zooming out, you can see the overall mesh again. Duplicating this Ricochet a second time, I want this one to be on the interior of the model, so that should be trapped inside again. The surface offset, I'll put that back to -1 and get rid of the shell. So that is what the sweep is doing. You see it's trapped on the interior, and now we've got a secondary Ricochet that's more on the exterior. I'd like to expand that a bit by giving a shell of 1 and an offset of 1, making sure that this Ricochet is perfectly outside. Now you see it's trapped on that outer shell. So this secondary line, how about that gets fed into a volume builder and a volume mesher, which is a giant blob. But going into the builder, I can increase the resolution by dropping the voxel size down to 1. And then selecting Ricochet, and here let's increase the density to 2 and the radius also to match it at 1. And excellent, that is now blobbed around on the outside. And you see those two things aren't intersecting. We've got this outer blob and then kind of this inner webbing bouncing around. So you can see how these might be able to start layering up, and the combinations can be incredibly powerful. Something I like doing with a volume mesher is creating a smoothing deformer, drop that as a child of the mesher, and that should make those blend together even better. Duplicate this material and make something, I don't know, maybe a nice orangey color. Drop that on this outer volume to fill that out. That wraps up that model. Moving on to the Zygote Man. I'll pop that one open. And again, I would like to steal this overall volume mesher. I'll make a copy of that. Delete out this character, drop in that one, and now we should see the next character get meshed. Hitting NB, we can see the different polygons. So there's quite a few polygons on that model. Moving this new model up to the top, and I'll create a null and feed everything else into it just to be a little bit clean and organized because we don't need to see them right now. Creating a new Ricochet. I'll leave this one at the origin, but I would like it to bounce off of this model. So under Objects, I'll feed in this volume mesher, moving the mesher above the Ricochet so we get the proper order of operations, just so there's no frame refresh issues. This time under Ricochet, I want multiple segments, and we can do that under Orientation. Under Orientation, we can say, I want this to be in matrix mode. There is now a link field that will accept a matrix object. Selecting the MoGraph menu, creating a matrix object. We have 40 by 1 by 1, I'll type in, and these are facing forward on Z. Scooting it back in the Ricochet, I will feed this matrix into that link field, and instantly we get 40 different segments. There are now 40 different lasers shooting off of this Ricochet, and they will be bouncing off of this model. Selecting the matrix, let's make this not quite as wide. I'll scoot it over, and I'm free to drag this upward, completely bouncing off this character, filling in the space, and you can see that as they bounce off the character, that we won't see them coming out from behind. This is really neat, and we can get a pretty cool scanning effect from this by using another new feature. Inside of the Ricochet, under the Modifier tab, there is a Terminator Object. If I were to drop that same volume mesher in as the Terminator Object, what this will do is, moving the matrix up, when a line from the Ricochet strikes the model, it's going to now end. That is the termination point of that. So now, as I drag this up, we can sort of get this scanning effect so that only where the model exists do we see that, and everything else will terminate before it moves away from it. So just another cool combination of options. For this next part, we don't need the entire model, so sorry there, mister, but we only need your head. Selecting the neck, I'll hit cut, paste, and now that is separate. And I'd like that to be the only thing fed into the volume builder. And there we go. We get this nice little blob going. We can increase the detail of that. I'll lower this down to 1 just to increase the resolution of that. And the matrix object, I would like that, instead of being a grid, switching this to a radial. So this is a radial effect. Crank up the count, and you'll see we get a whole bunch of them. Because, of course, if I turn off the Ricochet, we can see the individual matrix clones. In fact, if you want, you can keep matrix turned on, and there's under Ricochet, a visualize checkbox. And if I turn that on, you'll see the matrix lines represented. That is showing where the matrix is. But I don't need that. The matrix, I would like the radius to be down to 0. And keep in mind, this is still going to terminate when it hits that same model, because we haven't changed the volume. So if I were to take this and drag it up, it should hopefully, disappear as we enter inside of the center of this head. With the matrices and the Ricochet being inside of it, I would like to hide that model. So Ricochet, hide sources, and now we can see inside of it, we've kind of got this scanning effect. As we move the matrix, we can see the different parts of the model get revealed. Selecting Ricochet under basic, I would like to see it all the time, so I'll say on and change the color to white, just so it pops out for the model. So now you can see this scanning effect as it moves up. And you can easily imagine taking this and keyframing. Let's keyframe the position and rotation. Keyframe both, fast forward to the end, and at the end I'll have this moved way up. It's still inside R for rotation, and I'll spin that around a few times. And keyframe both of those again, rewinding and hitting play. We should now get a scanning effect traveling up and around through the model as it goes, and just opens up a lot of cool opportunities for that as well. In the training series, I actually talk about a series of clones copied onto the tips of these Ricochet lines, and then tracing those so you can get a really cool scanning effect throughout the entire model. For the next effect, I think you can get his body back. We'll drop that back in. The matrix could still be dragged around the entire thing and get a scanning effect from that. What I'd like to show, though, is deleting the matrix, and actually inside the Ricochet, under Modify, we don't need that Terminator object anymore. Hitting clear on that, it should be bouncing around like regular. And under Ricochet, going back to the default of Z+. When we're back to that default orientation, you'll see that there is a Create Matrix button. If I were to click it, it is going to automatically create a matrix object with a bunch of settings already pre-built in. It selected it by default, and it automatically, inside the Ricochet, got fed into that link field for us. The Ricochet by default has gotten different defaults. It's in surface mode. It automatically got fed that first object as a source. It's got a count of 10, and under Transform, there is a little offset to minus 0.1. So that means that the matrix is slightly inside the surface, and we scaled them down so that they're not eating up too much visual space, and flipped them around 180 so that these individual segments are shooting inward and not shooting out of the model. You could, of course, switch these around and put this on a positive amount, so say positive, and flip that 180 around, and now those should all be shooting away from the model instead of bouncing around inside. Obviously, we want bouncing around inside. If I were to turn off the Ricochet, we can see the individual matrices cloned onto the model, and we shrunk them down because by default those would be pretty huge and eating up a lot of visual space. So with Ricochet turned back on, you can now see we've got 10 different origin points. So there are 10 different lasers essentially bouncing around inside the model. So another way of filling out the model even more so, and I'll hide the model, would be to grab the matrix and crank up the count. So we can have more and more and more origin points. And now that has its own seed, so I could keep on clicking that and get different layouts of the initial matrix. And that works quite nicely overall. That can be cranked up all the way, and back in the Ricochet, let's put that Terminate back in. So under Modifier, I want the Terminator object, again, to be that same mesh. So now they'll get terminated the instant that they hit an opposite side, thus stopping them from bouncing. So now we get a single straight line. Selecting the matrix, I could add a lot more count. Let's make it 1000, and now there's a series of straight lines making up that character. Selecting the random seed in the matrix, we could have a different layout. And I forgot, but Ricochet also generated this random effector put inside of the matrix. It's turned off by default, but inside a parameter, we turned off the position, but turned on rotation. So I can turn that on and get some baseline rotation of 89 degrees and 89 degrees, enough rotation so that it doesn't shoot out of the model. and has maximum randomness. So just visually another effect of this filling out the overall character. Lastly for this model, how about we try and get some color variation? Moving on into my Ricochet, we can move into the Spline tab and you'll see that there is an explode segments. Currently, if I were to make this editable, you'll see a single spline is getting returned with a bunch of different segments. If I hit undo and then say explode segments, we are now returning a null with a bunch of individual splines. Each segment has become its own spline. So along those lines, we could start colorizing them. We won't be able to see that though because you see it's highlighted in orange. So I will lock this and deselect Ricochet so we can now see the unhighlighted object. So colorize, I want it to be random, and you'll now see every color of the rainbow, any possible color. Hitting randomize, we'll get completely different color layouts. Moving from colorize into grayscale, we can get any random color from black to white and every gray in between just randomly. And finally, we can switch over to from matrix, and it will all turn teal because, let's unlock attributes, because in the matrix object, you'll see it defaults to the Ricochet teal color by default. So we can set that to any color, and that will colorize all of the matrices and thus all of the segments by that color. But of course, we could then add a MoGraph, let's say plane effector. I don't want it to affect the position, but I would like it to affect the field's color. So under fall off, give it maybe a solid and tell the solid to do something with color, and I can set the color directly through that. So let's do a kind of bright green color, and then on top of that, maybe a random field. Turn on color for that, and under field, we've got different colors. Let's set this to a really fast animation speed, and that's set to max, but we could set that to overlay. We could set that to add. We could set the screen. Hitting play now, you can see that those colors will be shifting around as the color changes. Just to show you, I'll set that to normal. And you can see these colors shifting around from the matrix object. Now, of course, we have now exploded this into a bunch of different objects. Cinema tends to like having fewer objects with lots of segments. So this creating in, currently, because we have 1,000 different matrices, this will be 1,000 different objects that it is returning. So that will be slower, but it really unlocks a lot of possibilities to do additional controls through MoGraph. In this new scene file, I've got these 3 letters for rocket fed into a builder, into a volume mesher, and you can see that there's a nice even poly count. They are all 4-sided, and it's pretty rounded. A good setup to show some of the new features. Creating a new Ricochet, I would like it at the bottom for proper order of operations. The source geometry will be objects, feed it the volume mesher, hide the original object. It's bouncing around on the inside, but I'd like it to have 10 different origin points from a matrix, so the same create matrix button. There are now 10 different segments going around. If I turn off Ricochet, we can see those different origin points around. We can even crank that up if we want. Let's jump that up to, I don't know, let's say 100. So 100 different Ricochet segments. Let's have some fun layering up a bunch of Ricochets here. So my thought is we don't need this length to be nearly as long. So we'll pull back on that and we see them bouncing around. We'll just pull that up until, we got pretty solid volume filled here. We can do a little bit of from surface so they're not all traveling through the center all the time. Whichever level of randomness looks nice to us. And I'd like to feed this Ricochet into a volume builder. So volume mesher, backwards, so volume builder, volume mesher, volume builder. I would like it to be 1. Ricochet be at 1, set the density to, 2. 2 is usually a pretty good number. And we can now see a big old blob of these traveling around, filling up space. So that seems to be working pretty well. We can hide that original mesh completely, and we can now see the end result of this Ricochet bouncing around. Maybe I want to smooth that out. Smoothing, drop that in, get that smoothed out a little bit, looking really cool and weird and blobby. So with that all built, what if we make a second iteration of this? So here's this volume mesher. Let's just copy and paste it, and I'll move this copy pasted rig all the way to the bottom, and I want to do some other setup this time. So I'm thinking this time, what if the Ricochet is seeing not only that original volume mesher, but it's also seeing this other volume. So let's just rename, well, it's already volume mesher 1, volume mesher 2. Let's just keep those straight in our head. So let's say, hey, you are also seeing this other volume mesher. That's going to be figuring itself out. We need another material so we can make one of them stand out from the first one. So we'll go with a nice bright pink. Drop that on our secondary one. And now you can see that it's bouncing inside that same object, but those two are avoiding each other because those lines cannot get near the other one. temporarily turning off that volume. You can see this is bouncing around on the inside all over the place, but it can't get into that volume if it wasn't already inside. We do have the option of this matrix that is kind of bouncing around. We could say, well, we want that to be on the inside of that one, or it is currently on the other volume measure. We could simplify this significantly. Let's say that this is only a linear, and that linear will be set to 1. So I've got exactly 1 ricochet. And that can be manually placed now by this singular ricochet. I can scoot that out to the outside. And now you can see that is bouncing. And it's going to bounce, 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 bounce. As I increase the length of that single ricochet, it can go longer, longer, longer. And you see it's bouncing around, bouncing around, bouncing around. So it's trapped within this original mesh. But it's also trapped outside of that one. So we get 2 different blobs. Now, as we have talked about, we can expand those. So inside of Ricochet, I can say, hey, the sources that you're seeing, expand those a bit. I don't want to go too far. Let's say 0.5. Those should expand a bit. And now this is going to have less places it can travel, but it is going to keep it a little bit away from that surface, making sure that, yeah, this is still, it still has a good origin kind of in a void right there. So we can just play with these too. I think it's pretty open for us to make modifications. So let's make that original Ricochet not quite as long. So I'll drop that down to 222. So that should be a little bit more open. And now this can bounce around a little bit more. Selecting this Ricochet, we can add more randomness into it. And we see how it's bouncing around. Let's double that length. So maybe it travels around more. And click random seed a few times and see if we can get a nice looking one where it's sort of traveling throughout. That one's working pretty well. So we can see that traveling throughout the entire setup pretty well. So just reactivate that volume. And now we've got a secondary layer that should be avoiding the first layer. And we could keep on layering up more and more and more of these, each of them avoiding the mesh that came before it. Now, something else I really like to do with these is, that is a ricochet that is creating those bounces. But what if we make some drips? Drips are always cool looking in renders and animations. So what I'm thinking is, we've got this line. Let's turn off that volume. So we've got this line, we've got this ricochet bouncing around. And how about creating another matrix? And this matrix, I will say, hey, you are going to clone onto an object. That object will be this other ricochet. And now it's creating exactly 10 of them kind of throughout this line, exactly evenly spaced as it bounces around. Let's jump that up to, I don't know, 33. So now we got a bunch of those around. I would like it not to align. So turn off align and you see they're just sitting there. Let's make a new ricochet. Extensions, ricochet. And this ricochet, I'll say, hey, this is a drip. And this matrix also is a matrix drip. This ricochet should reference, I'm not going to let it bounce off anything, that doesn't matter, but I would like it to be based off of a matrix. The matrix is the matrix drip. And now we've got a bunch of lines shooting straight out in space that direction. That's fine. But I would like these aimed down. So let's grab that original matrix and change its initial input. So let's rotate these. Which axis is it? This one. So let's say -90. And now those are all aimed straight down, but we know that they're starting on one of those lines. And if we were inclined, I could say, okay, ricochet, those can push down, but if they happen to collide with this other mesh, then they will terminate. So let's see what we get. So Terminator Object, that will be that light colored volume measure. It might be easier if we make a white, put that on there. So that white one, I want to avoid that. So this new ricochet, if it collides with that, it will terminate. Drag that into the Terminator Object. And now you can see some of the lines move down and the other ones that would strike it, they're not going to pass through because they will stop. So all those lines are pretty long. I don't want them to be that long. So pulling back on the overall length, pull back, 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 back. Let's pull this way down like 55. Yeah, that's more of a reasonable range. Those are all pushing down. They're all pushing down the exact same length though. So something we haven't talked about, and we're not going to talk about too much here in the quick start. You should check it out in the full training video, is under modify, there is a multiplier field. So I can go inside there and say, hey, I'm going to feed in a field. And what should that drive? I want it to drive the length. So it's going to multiply on that. So I'm going to multiply on the length, create a random field. And now that random field, you'll see as I turn it on and off, is going to change the length of the way these are being drawn. And I guess I can't turn it off there. I can turn it off by saying none. And you can see those are full length. And when they turn on, we now get random ones. So I could even extend those if I were so inclined now because we have got that random. So now some of those will be longer. Excellent. So now we got this drip. This drip can probably be moved directly inside of that same volume builder, the purple one. turn this on, I can now see how this is being fed in. It is union. The radius is 1.5. I would like it just to be 1, and those drips should be moving down now. And if I wanted to, we could create a cloner and put it there on the bottom. Keep it simple. Create a cloner. Inside the cloner, feed a sphere. Put the sphere in the cloner. Way too big. T for scale. Scale way down. Clone onto what? Well, I want to clone onto an object. The object will be the drip. Drop that on. Now we've got 10. I only want there to be 1 per segment. Turn off loop and crank up your offset, and you'll see those spheres push down to the very bottom of each of those lines. So with that, we could randomize these as well. I can grab the transform and scale up on, I think, Z. Yeah, so those will get stretched out a little bit. We could randomize them. I won't in this case, but let's just drop those inside of the volume builder. Now those should get blobbed as well. Activate the smoothing, activate the mesher, and those should all get meshed and blobbed together. Spheres a little bit big. I'll pull back on the radius of those. So now we get those little drips. And you see that these lines are getting real skinny. So let's increase those a bit. So there's that drip. I would like the radius to maybe be 1.5. Yeah, that's better. Maybe somewhere in between, like 1.2. There we go. So now we get these different drips pulling down. They are definitely going down from where the purple is because they were spawned off that same Ricochet. And then if they bump too much into a big clump of this white, they'll just terminate there, but still make a drip. If we don't like this layout, I can always grab the matrix and say, hey, let's do a offset. So I'll do a little bit of an offset in there, and we're going to get completely different layouts. And I just want to find one where they're not overlapping. Maybe if the drips are touching each other, it's fine, but we can just click a few times. There we go. There's one where they're not colliding into each other. We get automatic drips. I can crank this up. Let's make there be way more lines dripping down. And now we get them just oozing. And this is using 3 different ricochets all layered on top of each other. And immediately you can see you make some crazy looking stuff. And of course, this can combine with all other aspects of Cinema 4D and MoGraph tools. So the possibilities really are endless. Something for you to keep in mind is we've got this question mark button down here, which will jump to the help page, which should have descriptions of how to do a bunch of this stuff, as well as videos to go over every single feature. And then this will lead to an examples page where hopefully there will be an increasing amount of scene files and tutorials on exactly how to do a whole bunch of different cool things using Ricochet.